Hi everyone, welcome back to Hazel's Flight School Wine Edition. I'm Lily Margolis,
And I'm Rob Linhart.
and today we're talking about natural and organic wines.
So, natural and organic wines are becoming a huge, blowing up category. So, what do you think you know about what makes a wine organic or biodynamic or natural for that matter?
Well, I'm guessing that it's the winemaking process, just based off of my very basic knowledge of organic food certifications, and I know those involve like what pesticides can be used and what fertilizers, stuff like that. So I'm gonna guess it would be similar to those.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, grapes are an agricultural product, so mostly in the production of this, they're going to be following the same rules for organic and biodynamic and natural production as we would for any other sort of food crop. But there are some specific rules. For sure, no synthetic pesticides or herbicides allowed, which is not to say there can't be pesticides or herbicides. They just have to be sort of naturally produced, just things that are brewed up from plants in the environment and so on. Lots of ways that producers will go down that road and winemakers will figure that out. In the natural wine world, they want to use what they call only native yeast. And what that means is just whatever yeast is growing on the grapes in the vineyard, that's the yeast that's going to make those grapes ferment. So a natural wine producer typically is not going to inoculate with a commercial yeast or something like that. They're just going to what they call spontaneous fermentation.
So no adding the little packets you buy at the grocery store.
Definitely not. Now, for organic production, as it happens, you can actually use cultured yeast, but if you want to call yourself organic or you want to be certified organic, that has to be an organically produced yeast. Don't ask me how they do that process. I'm not quite in the loop on that, but it can be done, and some producers do. So I think we should dive into the wines here, and we'll chat a little bit as we go here. So the first wine we're tasting is coming out of Oregon, where they are really committed to organic and natural food production. Back in 2015, I was told when I was in Oregon playing with some of these wineries that as much as 70% of the produce grown in Oregon is grown organically. Now, that's not all certified organic, but if you're going to bet blind on produce, Oregon seems like a pretty good place to go. So here we have a winery that is practicing organic, practicing biodynamic, but is not certified. And we'll chat about that in a second here.
So why would a winery who's practicing organic decide not to be organically certified?
Bottom line is, getting certified is expensive. And it's an excruciating process to go through. It takes years, it takes so much effort and time and money and commitment. And if you mess up even one step along the way, you might have to go back and start over, and it can be brutal. So many producers out there are practicing organic, practicing biodynamic, but are not going to pursue certification because money.
Yeah,
basically.
makes sense.
Right.
Do you think that practicing organic versus being certified, like, it seems to me that if you're practicing organic, people are still going to accept, okay, this is organic and we trust the winery to be following that. But do you think some wineries say that they're practicing organic and it's not truly up to par?
I would like to think not. I'm not aware of any that are kind of cheating like that. Humans being humans, it could happen, but let's think the best of our wine producers.
Yeah, it does seem to be generally accepted that all of them get the green light.
Yeah. So let's dive in. I want to start here with this because I've been waiting to get a crack at this for a while for this new vintage. That is good Oregon Pinot right there.
It's really good.
So we've been talking about organic. We haven't really talked much about the biodynamic side of things. And biodynamic is really a step beyond organic, and you can go really far beyond organic when it comes to the biodynamic world. Do you know much about biodynamics, how that's supposed to work?
I don't know what the difference is.
Got it. I admit I don't know everything about that. It can be very involved. But the key takeaway is you're basically starting out growing organically, all natural, nothing synthetic going on in the vineyards or in the winery. And then you'll start to get into looking at cycles, the cycles of the moon, the week, the year, seasons, all sorts of things come into play. When people take a really deep dive, you'll get into discussing even gnomes and fairies and things like that that are out there in the vineyard. No judgment. But truth be told, when you sort of take a deeper dive into this, you'll find that producers who are practicing organically and also biodynamically, we can and we often do see a difference, an improvement in the quality of the wine. Now, it may turn out to be that there's a lot of truth to some of these biodynamic principles, following the natural cycles of the earth and the universe and so on. I'm not waving my hands at that and saying there's nothing to that. But especially with the organic and the biodynamic production, one of the things that you have to be able to do as a winemaker, as a viticulturalist, when you're growing these grapes, you have to pay so much more attention to what's going on in the vineyard. You don't just get to say, oh, there's bugs, I'm going to throw something around to kill the bugs. You have to be much more on top of things. So the winemakers, the viticulturalists, if nothing else, are just so much more in touch and so much more in tune with what's going on in the vineyards, that overall we tend to see improvements in quality when it comes to the wines.
And when we're saying biodynamic practices, I know you're saying like paying attention to moon cycles and the time of year. Can you give an example of something a winemaker would be doing? Is that like harvesting at a certain time or irrigating at a certain time?
Absolutely. All those things come into play. There are other elements like I know that in certain biodynamic practices, you will take whatever your compost is that you're using, you'll put it into the horn of a bull or a cow, and you'll bury that in between the vines with specific orientations based on calculations that you've made. And the intention there is to maximize the effectiveness of that fertilization, if you will. And again, no expert here, so performing those calculations is best left to someone who's been doing it for a while and understands what's going on. But when we taste wines, and we often experience this when we're tasting wines, there'll be discussions about the fruit cycle of the wine even after it's been in the bottle. And you'll hear people talk about, is it a fruit day? Is it a root day? Those sorts of things. And there's an actual calendar out there, like a biodynamic calendar, that you can look at and you can decide, I want my wine to show its fruit the best today, so I'm going to make sure I open it and show it around town when it's a fruit day. Or I want to emphasize the earthiness of my wine, so I will look at that biodynamic calendar and I will say, I want to show this around on a root day.
Yeah. I had incorrectly thought that biodynamic was more related to the terroir of a wine, like choosing to house maybe certain species of bugs or animals or plants on the same land as the vineyard. Is that incorporated into biodynamic wine too, or is that a separate category?
I would not be surprised to find that there are some aspects of that are being incorporated there. But certainly the goal, especially with organic, and there's a category we're not really talking about here, regenerative farming, which is really becoming a thing, and natural farming and natural growing, where you really want to create the best possible environment for the grapes and for everything else that's living around that. And the idea is to create this beautiful ecosystem around your vines where all the plants, all the animals, everything is they're all supporting each other, and with the goal of creating a better wine.
Yeah. So you could say that organic, biodynamic, and natural winemaking all kind of intertwine, and you can't really have just aspects of one. Like, if you're doing one, you're probably going to have some elements of one of the other techniques as well.
Most likely, yeah. I would say that probably with the biodynamic stuff, you're taking a step beyond organic. There's crossover with organic and natural because you're going to be practicing organically. But organic producers, natural producers, aren't necessarily following biodynamic rules. So it might go one way, maybe not so much the other.
Okay.
So let's dive into our second wine here. Now, this is a Syrah from Philippe Viret. We're in the Rhone. And when we talk about natural wines, we'll use terms like super natty and supernatural. These guys are super natural, and they are also super biodynamic, so very serious. We're talking about crystals in the winery, crystals in the barrel room. When they built part of their facility, when they hacked the rock out of the ground to build this winery, they numbered all the stones so they could go back together in the same order to keep the energy of that earth, to keep that going in the vineyard. So they took that very, very seriously. And let's see if it shows in the wine. What do you think?
Well, this seems to be heavier on the nose. I'm noticing that these two have a very similar acidic content, and that's something I've noticed when I've tried other natural wines outside of this room as well, is that they all seem to have a very high acid content.
Bit of an elevated acidity?
And is that just, does that just happen to be the natural wines I've tried, or is that a common characteristic?
I think that's likely a coincidence more than anything, for sure, because all wine grapes, some of them will have more acid, some will have less acid. Now, the terroir itself can definitely have an influence on that. But the practices themselves, I'm not confident would necessarily be driving that bus. What I will say is this wine has life. This wine feels really alive to me, very vibrant on the palate. And for this particular producer as well, producing in this manner, they are using now natural practices. So this wine definitely using native yeast, or the yeast that's just in the vineyard. And I don't know about you, but I'm picking up on that a little bit. I'm getting a little sense of the yeast. It gives just a little hint of something animal, we would say, or slightly gamey. I tend to get that with these natural wines. It's not always for everybody, and sometimes it can dominate the wine, but here, not so much. And I really like the freshness of this wine. And I think what they're going for is creating a wine that's alive and lively and vigorous. And they've succeeded as far as I'm concerned. I think this wine is delicious.
Yeah, it's great.
All right.
So we've talked about practicing organic certifications, and now natural wine. So is there an exact line drawn between natural wine and organic wine?
Not really. And natural wine is really a big expanding category. But the fact of the matter is that there's no real good definition of what a natural wine would be. Here at Hazel's and in the wine community, we prefer a term like low intervention would be a good way to describe it. So minimal monkey business in the vineyards, and for sure a responsible natural producer. If they're not cheating, they're gonna be growing organically. They're probably gonna be using biodynamic principles as well. Really one of the main key takeaways is that use of native yeast or natural yeast, and not inoculating with some sort of commercial yeast. So natural wines, by and large, can be organic, they can be biodynamic, and they primarily are. One important note, however, when it comes to sulfur, to be certified organic in the US and the EU, you cannot add additional sulfur to a wine. But that is not true for natural wines. A natural wine producer is allowed to add a little bit of sulfur into their wines, and that's because there actually are no rules when it comes to natural wine. There's no cutoff, there's no official limit, there's no official definition. So we will see that from time to time with natural wine producers.
And how does sulfur impact wine?
Well, if we get too much of it, it just plain smells sulfury. But the main use of sulfur is for hygiene. It's a way, it acts as an antibacterial agent to prevent spoilage. It stabilizes the wine. Sulfur mops up free oxygen in a wine, so it prevents the wine from oxidizing prematurely and becoming faulted too soon when it's in bottle. And it can also be used to control yeast. One of the main issues with natural wines that can come up is a yeast that we don't tend to like, although the beer guys might dispute this, Brettanomyces or Brett. It's a yeast that can produce barnyardy and horsey sorts of aromas, and not everybody's on board with that. And it turns out that sulfur is really effective at controlling that. So particularly with natural wines, where there's a higher likelihood of getting that infection, for lack of a better word, sometimes a little bit of sulfur is deemed necessary in order to get that under control and manage that in the winery.
Would a wine that's mass produced, something like Cupcake, for example, would that have a higher level of sulfur if they want to make sure that all of the wines are more like similar bottle to bottle, that they're all tasting the same?
That is a very good question I don't have the answer to. Now, it happens that when you're getting into some of these higher level, higher production level wines, they're going to have other techniques for hygiene and so on and so forth. They're certainly going to be using inoculated yeast, commercial yeasts, and so on. So in fact, they may have less of a need to try to control those things and therefore a lower use of sulfur. But don't hold me to that. I will also say, typically, white wines need more sulfur than red wines in order to remain stable. That's just a thing. Last but not least, we're off to Bordeaux. That is just straight up and down right bank Bordeaux right there for me. What are you picking up?
For me, definitely a lot of plum notes, a little coffee bean background, some like bitterness going on there. Yeah, it's really solid.
Nice, and I agree. Now, this is a wine. We talked about SAS, practicing organic and biodynamic. We talked about Philippe Viret, practicing fully natural, but also fully biodynamic. But no indication that they're certified here. But here with Chateau Peybonon-Latour, we are talking about a winery that is certified biodynamic and organic. And number one, that means no added sulfur in order to have that certification. But they still managed to get very good freshness there. And that's an illustration of how fresh, how vibrant this wine is, and stable, right? Tastes great. Nothing funky going on in this wine, and they managed to do that without sulfur. So good producers working very cleanly in the vineyard, very cleanly in the winery, can produce these stable, delicious, fresh, lively wines without adding sulfur. And that's a kind of a key takeaway here, I think, with this wine.
You know, I think through trying these three wines, the best descriptor you've used, at least for me, for organic, biodynamic, and natural wine has definitely been that the wines taste alive. You can definitely tell like that how much care went into the creation.
I agree. When I was in Oregon, a little longer ago than I would care to admit, question was asked of a bunch of winemakers. It was a panel discussion. We had conventional winemakers growing who were using synthetic pesticides and so on, and we had winemakers who had gone through the process of converting to organic and biodynamic. And the question was asked of the organic growers, knowing what you know and knowing what you went through to create these wines and to go down that organic and biodynamic road, would you go back? Would you do it again? Would you put yourself through that? And do you think the wines are better? And the answers were, no, we would not go back. And yes, we think the wines are better. So there is definitely seems to be a really good motivation for producers to go down that road. And for sure, better for the environment, better for us. And if we can get better wines in the process, so much the better. I feel like we had a great discussion here. I hope you learned a lot about organic and biodynamic and natural wines. Any final thoughts?
No, but now I know that I definitely want to try some more.
Awesome. So do I. That's going to do it for today. Special thanks to Eric Bellamy and Natural Wine Company for providing these awesome wines and their expertise.
Thanks for tuning in for Flight School today. Subscribe to us on YouTube and ask your questions in the comments.